The champagne bubbles caught the afternoon light like tiny diamonds, but Captain Sarah Chen felt invisible among the celebration. She stood near the mahogany bar in the corner of the elegant ballroom, watching her younger sister Melissa pose for endless photographs in her pristine white gown. The laughter around her felt hollow, each smile a reminder that she didn't belong in this carefully orchestrated world of silk and ceremony. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah adjusted the sleeves of her navy dress uniform, the fabric crisp against her skin. She had debated whether to wear it, knowing how her family felt about her military service, but something inside her refused to hide who she had become. The medals on her chest told stories her family had never bothered to ask about, stories of courage in places they couldn't pronounce, of lives saved and moments that stretched like eternities. Her mother, Patricia Chen, glided past without so much as a glance, her attention focused entirely on the photographer's directions. Sarah wasn't surprised. She had learned long ago that her mother's love came with conditions, and military service wasn't one of them. The woman who had once dreamed of her daughters becoming doctors or lawyers had never quite forgiven Sarah for choosing a path that led through combat zones instead of corporate boardrooms. The wedding venue itself was everything their mother had wanted, a sprawling estate in Napa Valley with rolling hills and vineyards stretching toward the horizon. Crystal chandeliers hung from exposed wooden beams, and white roses cascaded from every available surface. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely devoid of anything that reflected Sarah's presence in the family. She found her assigned table near the kitchen doors, far from the head table where Melissa held court with her new husband. The place card read simply, S. Chen, as if using her full name might somehow contaminate the elegant calligraphy. Sarah had driven 8 hours from her base in Colorado for this moment, taking precious leave time she could have spent anywhere else. But family obligations died hard, even when the family in question treated you like an unwelcome guest at your own sister's wedding. The tension had been building for months before the wedding. Sarah remembered the phone call when Melissa announced her engagement to David Morrison, son of a prominent defense contractor. Their mother had been ecstatic, already planning the social connections this marriage would bring. Sarah had offered her congratulations, but the conversation had quickly shifted to logistics and expectations. "I hope you'll dress appropriately," Patricia had said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of disapproval. "This isn't some military function. It's a sophisticated affair." Sarah had bitten back her response, swallowing the words that would have reminded her mother that she had attended state dinners at the Pentagon, that she understood sophistication better than anyone gave her credit for. Instead, she had simply agreed to come, knowing that her absence would become another weapon in her mother's arsenal of disappointment. The weeks leading up to the wedding had been a master class in subtle exclusion. Melissa had asked their 3 cousins to be bridesmaids, but hadn't extended the invitation to Sarah. When questioned, she had shrugged and claimed they needed someone to handle other responsibilities. Sarah had found herself relegated to the role of distant relative, expected to attend but not participate, to smile but not speak, to exist on the periphery of their own family celebration. The breaking point had come during the rehearsal dinner the night before. Sarah had arrived in a simple black dress, hoping to blend into the background. She had found her seat at a table with distant relatives and family friends, people who knew her name but nothing about her life. The conversation had flowed around her like water around a stone, polite acknowledgments followed by swift redirections to more comfortable topics. When the toasts began, Sarah had listened as speaker after speaker praised Melissa's beauty, her grace, her perfect choice in a husband. Her father had spoken about his pride in his daughter's accomplishments, listing her marketing degree and her volunteer work with local charities. Her mother had wept delicately as she described the joy of seeing her baby girl find such a wonderful match. Sarah's military service went unmentioned. Her 2 tours in Afghanistan, her Bronze Star for Valor, her rapid promotion through the ranks, none of it existed in their carefully curated version of family history. She might as well have spent the last 8 years invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of their perfect narrative. The final insult had come when Melissa stood to thank everyone for their support. She had smiled sweetly as she acknowledged aunts and uncles, childhood friends, and college roommates. She had thanked her parents for their guidance and her future in-laws for welcoming her into their family. But when her gaze swept over Sarah's table, it passed right through her, as if she were simply part of the furniture. That night, alone in her hotel room, Sarah had stared at the ceiling and wondered why she had come. Her fellow officers would have understood if she had skipped the wedding entirely. Her commanding officer had practically ordered her to take the leave time, insisting that family was important. But sitting in that room full of people who shared her DNA but not her dreams, Sarah had felt more alone than she had ever had in the mountains of Kandahar. She had almost left then, almost packed her bag and driven back to Colorado in the darkness. But something had stopped her, some stubborn refusal to let them erase her completely. She would attend the wedding, she had decided. She would wear her dress uniform with pride. She would sit in whatever corner they assigned her and hold her head high because she had earned the right to exist in any room, even one that didn't want her. Now, as the ceremony approached, Sarah watched the controlled chaos of last-minute preparations. Melissa's bridesmaids fussed over her veil while the photographer captured every moment of manufactured perfection. Their mother directed traffic with the precision of a general, ensuring that every detail aligned with her vision of social triumph. Sarah remained in her corner, observing but not participating, present but not acknowledged. She had learned in the military that sometimes the most powerful position was the one that allowed you to see everything while being seen by no one. Today, that invisibility felt less like strategy and more like exile, but she wore it anyway, armor fashioned from years of disappointment and disappointment overcome. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, the family's greatest source of shame, was also its most decorated member. While Melissa had collected sorority awards and marketing commendations, Sarah had earned the respect of soldiers and the gratitude of a nation. But medals meant nothing in a world that valued appearances over substance, connections over character. As the minutes ticked toward the ceremony's start, Sarah straightened her uniform one last time and prepared to play her assigned role in this elaborate performance. She would be the dutiful sister, the forgotten daughter, the inconvenient reminder of paths not taken and dreams not shared. But beneath the surface, she carried something they couldn't touch or diminish, the knowledge of who she really was and what she had accomplished in spite of their indifference. The ceremony began with the soft strains of a string quartet, their music floating through the vineyard air like something from a fairy tale. Sarah watched from her assigned seat in the back row, positioned behind a decorative pillar that partially obscured her view of the altar. She wondered if the placement was intentional, another small reminder of her place in the family hierarchy. Melissa walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her dress trailing behind her like liquid moonlight. She looked radiant, genuinely happy, and for a moment Sarah felt a pang of something that might have been sisterly affection. Whatever their differences, whatever hurt lay between them, this was Melissa's day. She could give her that much. The officiant spoke about love and commitment, about two families joining together as one. Sarah's eyes drifted to the groom's side of the aisle, noting the perfectly pressed uniforms scattered among the civilian guests. David Morrison came from military stock, though he himself had chosen the family business over service. His father, she knew, was General Marcus Morrison, recently retired after a distinguished career that included multiple combat commands. Sarah recognized some of the faces from military publications and news reports.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
There was Admiral Catherine Wells, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. Colonel James Harrison sat with his wife, his chest bearing ribbons that Sarah knew represented campaigns in Iraq and Somalia. These were people who understood the weight of service, the sacrifice it demanded, the honor it bestowed. Yet none of them seemed to notice her presence in the back row. She was just another guest in dress blues, unremarkable among the sea of uniforms that graced military weddings. Sarah had hoped that maybe, just maybe, her own service would be acknowledged in this setting, where it should have meant something. But she remained invisible, even among her own kind. The reception that followed was a masterpiece of social engineering. Patricia Chen had spared no expense in creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. Tables draped in ivory silk surrounded a polished dance floor, while servers in crisp white shirts moved between guests with trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The setting sun painted the hills in shades of gold and amber, providing a backdrop that would make every photograph a work of art. Sarah found herself seated at table 12, the numerical designation feeling like a judgment in itself. Her table mates included distant cousins she barely knew, family friends who remembered her as Melissa's awkward older sister, and an elderly aunt who spent most of her time complaining about the music volume. The conversation flowed around topics Sarah couldn't contribute to: stock portfolios, European vacations, and the social politics of country club memberships. She picked at her salmon, watching as Melissa and David made their rounds to each table, accepting congratulations and posing for photos with their guests. The couple moved with practiced grace from table to table, spending long minutes with the important guests while offering quick smiles to others. Sarah calculated that at their current pace, they would reach her table sometime after midnight. The toasts began as dessert was served. Patricia Chen stood first, her champagne flute catching the light as she raised it high. Her speech was polished perfection, every word carefully chosen to reflect the image she wanted to project. She spoke of her daughter's beauty and grace, her successful career in marketing, her perfect choice in a husband. She painted a picture of Melissa as the ideal daughter, the fulfillment of every mother's dreams. "To my beautiful Melissa," Patricia concluded, her voice thick with emotion, "who has always known exactly who she was meant to be." The applause was warm and sustained, the kind of response that comes from genuine affection mixed with good wine. Sarah's father spoke next, his remarks shorter but equally glowing. He talked about walking his little girl to school, teaching her to ride a bike, watching her grow into the accomplished woman she had become. His voice cracked slightly as he mentioned how proud he was of the life she had built for herself. General Morrison rose when Sarah's father finished, his bearing unmistakably military despite his civilian attire. He was a tall man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "David chose well when he chose Melissa," the general began, his gaze sweeping the room. "Marriage is about finding someone who complements your strengths and supports you through your weaknesses. In this family, he's found people who understand the value of service, of putting something larger than yourself first." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps here, from this man who had dedicated his life to the military, would come some recognition of her own service. She straightened slightly in her chair, preparing for the acknowledgement that had been absent from every other speech. But General Morrison continued without pause, his focus remaining on the happy couple and their family's civilian accomplishments. He praised the Chen family's success in business, their commitment to charitable organizations, their dedication to education and the arts. The military remained unmentioned, as if it existed in a separate universe from this carefully curated celebration. The final speaker was David himself, handsome and confident as he thanked everyone for their presence. He spoke about finding his soulmate in Melissa, about the future they would build together, about the love and support of both families. His words were warm and sincere, painting a picture of two lives perfectly aligned in their goals and values. "I'm grateful," David said, his arm around his new wife's waist, "to be joining a family that shares our values of excellence, achievement, and putting family first." He raised his glass in a final toast, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. Sarah clapped politely, her hands moving mechanically while her mind processed what she had just witnessed. 3 speeches, 3 opportunities for someone to acknowledge her presence, her service, her existence as part of this family. 3 failures to see her as anything more than an inconvenient obligation, a duty discharged by the simple act of sending an invitation. The dancing began shortly after that. Couples swaying to music that spoke of love and hope and futures bright with promise. Sarah watched Melissa and David move across the floor with practiced grace, their happiness evident in every step. Around them, other couples joined in, creating a tapestry of movement and joy that Sarah observed from the sidelines. She considered leaving then, slipping away while everyone was distracted by the celebration. Her presence clearly wasn't necessary, wasn't wanted, wasn't even noticed. She could drive back to Colorado tonight, be back on base tomorrow morning, return to a world where her contributions mattered and her presence was valued. But something kept her in her seat, some stubborn streak that refused to let her family's indifference drive her away. She had earned the right to be here, not as their charity case or their source of embarrassment, but as a member of this family who had chosen a different path. Her uniform represented sacrifices they would never understand, achievements they would never acknowledge, but that didn't make them less real. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself studying the military guests scattered throughout the room. They moved with a different kind of confidence, carried themselves with a bearing that spoke of service and sacrifice. She wondered what they thought of her, sitting alone at the back table, clearly military, but equally clearly unwelcome among her own family. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a room full of people who claimed to support the troops, who wore flag pennons and spoke patriotic words, she was the only one who had actually walked the walk. She was the only one who had put her life on the line for her country, who had earned her position through merit rather than connections, who understood the true cost of the freedom they all enjoyed. The champagne continued to flow, the laughter grew louder, and the celebration swirled around Sarah like a river around a stone. She remained fixed in place, observing but not participating, present but not acknowledged, a ghost at her own sister's wedding. The night was far from over, and she sensed that something was building, some moment of reckoning that would either validate her presence or confirm her exile once and for all. The moment came when Sarah least expected it. She had been contemplating her escape, calculating the distance to the parking lot and whether she could slip away unnoticed, when General Morrison approached the microphone once more. The band had just finished a set, and the natural lull in conversation created an opening he seemed determined to fill. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried easily across the vineyard terrace, commanding attention with the effortless authority of decades in uniform. "I hope you'll indulge an old soldier for just a moment." The room quieted, guests turning toward the small stage where he stood with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to addressing crowds. Sarah felt a chill of premonition, though she couldn't have said why. Something in his bearing had shifted, becoming more formal, more purposeful. Military families understand sacrifice in ways that others sometimes cannot. We understand that service often means missing birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. We understand that duty sometimes calls us away from the people we love most. Sarah's pulse quickened. She glanced around the room, noting how the military guests had straightened in their chairs, recognizing the tone of an officer preparing to make an important point. The civilian guests looked politely attentive, but slightly puzzled, unsure where this unexpected speech was heading. 3 years ago, the general's voice grew stronger. His son David was embedded with a forward operating base in the Kandahar province. His convoy was ambushed during what should have been a routine supply run.
The vehicle he was riding in took a direct hit from an improvised explosive device. David Morrison, who had been standing near his new bride with champagne flute in hand, went perfectly still. His face paled as his father continued, and Sarah saw Melissa reach for his arm with sudden concern. The explosion killed 2 soldiers instantly and left 3 others severely wounded. General Morrison's words fell into absolute silence. David was trapped in the wreckage, unconscious and bleeding. The enemy fire was so intense that the rescue teams couldn't reach him. For 27 minutes, he lay in that destroyed vehicle while insurgents tried to overrun their position. Sarah felt the world shift around her. 27 minutes. Kandahar province. A convoy ambush. The details crystallized in her memory like pieces of a puzzle she had tried to forget. Her hands began to tremble, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. One officer refused to abandon him. The general continued, his eyes now scanning the crowd with deliberate intensity. Under heavy fire, with complete disregard for personal safety, this officer crawled 200 meters through open ground to reach the wreckage. She administered first aid while bullets rained down around them, then carried my unconscious son to safety. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah felt every eye turning, searching, trying to identify the hero in their midst. Her chest tightened as memories flooded back, the taste of dust and cordite, the weight of David's unconscious form across her shoulders, the burning sensation of shrapnel embedded in her leg. That officer saved my son's life, General Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. She risked everything for a fellow soldier she barely knew, because that's what honor demands. That's what the uniform represents. Patricia Chen's champagne flute slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone terrace with a sound like a gunshot. Sarah saw her mother's face drain of color as understanding dawned. Melissa stood frozen beside her new husband, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. General Morrison's eyes found Sarah across the crowded room, locking onto her with laser precision. "Captain Sarah Chen," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vineyard. "Would you please stand?" The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Every muscle in her body wanted to flee, to disappear, to avoid the spotlight that was about to destroy the careful fiction her family had built around her in her relevance. But decades of military discipline held her upright, forced her legs to straighten, compelled her to rise from her chair at the forgotten table. The room erupted in a collective gasp as hundreds of eyes focused on the woman in dress blues who had been sitting unnoticed in the shadows. Sarah stood ramrod straight, her hands at her sides, her chin raised despite the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Morrison's voice filled with unmistakable pride, "I present to you the officer who saved my son's life, Captain Sarah Chen, recipient of the Silver Star for gallantry in action, the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and the Bronze Star with V device for heroic achievement in a combat zone." The first person to react was Admiral Wells. The silver-haired woman rose from her chair with fluid grace, her movements sharp and precise as she snapped to attention and rendered a perfect salute. Colonel Harrison followed immediately, his own salute crisp and unwavering. One by one, every military officer in the room stood and saluted. The gesture rippled outward like a wave, encompassing decorated veterans from multiple services and conflicts. They held their positions with parade ground precision, a wall of respect and recognition that had been invisible to Sarah just moments before. David Morrison stared across the room at the woman who had saved his life, his face cycling through shock, recognition, and dawning horror at how she had been treated in his presence. His mouth worked soundlessly as he processed the revelation that his wife's despised sister was the hero who had crawled through hell to pull him from a burning vehicle. The civilian guests began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm as they grasped the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The sound built and swelled, filling the vineyard air with thunderous appreciation for a hero they had overlooked all evening. Sarah remained motionless, accepting the tribute with the stoic grace of a professional soldier. She didn't salute back, the protocol didn't require it, and she understood that this moment belonged to them, to the brotherhood and sisterhood of arms that transcended rank and service branch. Patricia Chen swayed on her feet, one hand pressed to her mouth in horror. The woman who had spent months planning the perfect wedding, who had orchestrated every detail to reflect her family's success and sophistication, watched her carefully constructed narrative crumble like sand. Her decorated daughter, the one she had tried to hide in the back row, stood revealed as the evening's true hero. Melissa looked between her husband and her sister, understanding finally dawning on her face. The sister she had dismissed as an embarrassment, the one she had relegated to the margins of her wedding party, had literally saved her husband's life. The irony was so perfect, so devastating, that she seemed unable to process it. General Morrison maintained his position at the microphone, allowing the moment to stretch and settle. When the applause finally began to fade, he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Captain Chen exemplifies everything we hope to achieve in our military leaders: courage under fire, selfless service, and an unwavering commitment to leaving no one behind. My family owes her a debt that can never be repaid. He paused, his eyes moving deliberately from Sarah to her parents, then to Melissa and David. It's an honor to have her here tonight, and I'm deeply grateful that fate has given me this opportunity to publicly acknowledge her extraordinary service to our nation and to my family. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time all evening, not from shame or hurt, but from the overwhelming recognition of being truly seen. For months, she had endured her family's indifference and dismissal. She had accepted their judgment that her chosen path was somehow lesser, somehow unworthy of acknowledgement or pride. Now, in front of everyone who mattered to them, the truth stood revealed. She wasn't the family failure they had painted her to be. She was a decorated combat veteran, a Silver Star recipient, a hero who had risked everything for a fellow soldier. The uniform she wore represented the highest ideals of service and sacrifice, values that transcended social status or civilian achievement. As the salutes finally dropped and the officers returned to their seats, Sarah found herself looking directly at her mother. Patricia Chen's face was ashen, her composure completely shattered. For the first time in Sarah's memory, her mother looked small, diminished, stripped of the authority she had wielded so mercilessly for so many years. The applause continued, growing even stronger as the full impact of the revelation settled over the crowd. Sarah stood in the center of it all, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, finally receiving the recognition that had been her due all along. The woman who had been seated at table 12, behind a pillar, forgotten and ignored, now commanded the attention and respect of everyone present. David Morrison began walking toward her, his steps uncertain but determined. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he approached the woman who had pulled him from the wreckage when death seemed certain. Behind him, Melissa followed, her wedding dress rustling against the stone as she struggled to process this complete reversal of everything she thought she knew about her sister. The evening that had begun with Sarah's exile was transforming into her vindication, but she felt no triumph,
only a quiet satisfaction that the truth had finally been spoken. She never needed their approval to know her worth, but having it acknowledged publicly, in front of the people who had dismissed her for so long, felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. David Morrison reached Sarah before anyone else could intercede. His face was a map of conflicting emotions: shock, recognition, and shame, and something deeper that might have been recognition of a debt too profound for words. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to speak privately, but far enough to maintain the military courtesy that the moment seemed to demand.
Captain Chen, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The formal address felt strange coming from someone she had known primarily as her sister's boyfriend, then fiancé, and now husband. "I remember you." Sarah studied his face, seeing past the polished civilian exterior to the young soldier she had pulled from burning metal. The scar along his jawline was barely visible now, hidden beneath expertly applied concealer for the wedding photos. But she remembered when it had been a gaping wound that bled through her field dressings. "Lieutenant Morrison," she replied, using his rank from that day 3 years ago. "You were unconscious for most of it." "Not all of it," David said, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "I remember waking up in the medevac. I remember asking the medic who had gotten me out. He said it was an officer named Chen who'd crawled through hell to reach me. I remember asking if you were okay, and he said you'd taken shrapnel in your leg but refused treatment until everyone else was stable." The conversation was quiet, but in the profound silence that had fallen over the vineyard terrace, every word carried. Sarah was aware of the hundreds of guests watching this reunion between hero and saved, aware of her family's stricken faces, aware of the way the entire evening had pivoted on this single revelation. "You were bleeding badly," Sarah said simply. "Someone had to get you out." "It should have been the rescue team," David's voice cracked. "It should have been someone with proper equipment, backup, air support. It shouldn't have been one officer against an entire insurgent position." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "There wasn't time to wait for proper. You would have died." The stark simplicity of her words hit the gathering like a physical blow. This wasn't a story from a movie or a book. This was real life and death, decided in moments when hesitation meant losing a fellow soldier forever. The guests who had spent the evening discussing stock options and vacation homes suddenly found themselves confronted with the reality of what military service actually meant. Melissa finally reached them, her wedding dress creating a circle of white around the reunion. Her face was pale, her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears she didn't seem to realize she was shedding. She looked between her husband and her sister as if seeing them both clearly for the first time. "Sarah," Melissa's voice was small, almost childlike, "why didn't you ever tell us?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that went far beyond the simple words. It contained years of family dinners where Sarah's service was dismissed, graduations where her achievements were overshadowed, holidays where her presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. Sarah turned her gaze to her sister, and for a moment, the years fell away. She saw not the successful marketing executive who had marginalized her, but the little girl who used to follow her around the backyard, who had cried when Sarah left for basic training, who had once promised to write every day. "You never asked," Sarah said quietly. "None of you ever asked what I actually did over there." The words cut through the vineyard air like a blade. Patricia Chen, who had managed to approach despite her obvious distress, flinched as if she had been physically struck. Behind her, Sarah's father stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. "We knew you were deployed," Patricia said, her voice defensive but shaking. "We knew you were serving. We just didn't think it mattered." Sarah finished for her. "You thought my service was something to be politely acknowledged and quickly forgotten. Something that made family gatherings awkward when people asked what I did for a living." General Morrison, who had been watching this family drama unfold from his position near the microphone, stepped forward. His presence commanded immediate attention, and the family members instinctively straightened as he approached. "Mrs. Chen," he addressed Patricia with the formal courtesy of a career officer, "with respect, your daughter's service record is extraordinary. She's been recommended for promotion to major twice, and both times her humility led her to defer in favor of ensuring her unit was properly prepared for transition. She's trained 3 different platoons of officers who are now serving with distinction throughout the world." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The Silver Star she received for saving David's life was personally presented by the Secretary of Defense. It's one of the highest honors our nation can bestow for gallantry in combat. There are generals with 40-year careers who have never achieved what your daughter accomplished in a single afternoon. Patricia Chen's face crumpled. The woman who had spent decades building her identity around her daughter's achievements, who had name-dropped their accomplishments at every social gathering, suddenly realized she had been overlooking the most remarkable success in her own family. "I didn't know," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Sarah never—" "Because she's a professional soldier," Admiral Wells interjected, stepping forward from where she had been observing the scene. "Captain Chen follows the warrior ethos. She doesn't seek recognition or glory. She does her job, protects her fellow soldiers, and serves her country with distinction." The Admiral's words carried the authority of someone who had risen to the highest levels of military leadership. When she spoke about warrior ethos and professional conduct, every person present understood they were hearing from someone who knew these qualities intimately. Sarah felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. She could see the path forward that her family wanted her to take. The gracious acceptance of their sudden recognition, the healing of old wounds, the restoration of family harmony. It would be easy to smile and nod, to accept their belated acknowledgement and pretend that years of dismissal could be erased by a single evening's revelation. But something deeper was at stake here, something that went beyond family dynamics or personal vindication. The young officers present tonight would remember this moment, would carry it forward in their own careers. The message they took from this evening mattered more than my family's comfort. "I didn't tell you about the medal or the commendation because they weren't the point. I did my job. I saved a fellow soldier because that's what you do. You don't leave people behind, and you don't do it for recognition."
She looked directly at Melissa, then at her parents. "But I also didn't hide my service because I was ashamed of it. I worn my uniform tonight because I'm proud of what it represents. I'm proud of every mission, every deployment, every moment I spent serving something larger than myself." The silence that followed was different from what had come before. It wasn't shocked or expectant, but contemplative. The guests were processing not just the revelation of Sarah's heroism, but the larger questions it raised about how society valued different types of service and achievement. David Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding, suddenly stepped forward and did something that surprised everyone present. He came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute to Sarah, holding it with the precision of someone who remembered his training even after years in civilian life. "Ma'am," he said formally, "I owe you my life. I owe you the chance to have this wedding, to marry the woman I love, to have a future I never would have seen without your courage. There is no debt in this world greater than the one I owe you." The gesture was so unexpected, so sincere, that it seemed to break something open in the evening's tension. Sarah returned the salute with military precision, acknowledging both the man he had been and the person he had become. When they both dropped their hands, David continued speaking, but now his words were directed not at Sarah, but at his new wife and in-laws.
"I've spent 3 years knowing that someone saved my life in Afghanistan," he said. "I've spent 3 years grateful to an unknown hero who risked everything for a fellow soldier. To discover that hero was sitting at the back of my wedding, ignored and dismissed by her own family, is something I will never forget." His words carried a weight that went beyond personal gratitude. They were a judgment, delivered with the moral authority of someone who had stared death in the face and been pulled back by the woman now standing before them all. The weight of David's words settled over the vineyard like evening mist, heavy with implications that extended far beyond the immediate family circle. Sarah watched her mother's face cycle through a spectrum of emotions: denial, shock, shame, and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine remorse. Patricia Chen had built her identity around being the mother of successful daughters, but now she faced the reality that she had failed to recognize the most extraordinary achievement in her own family. The other guests began to murmur among themselves, conversations rippling outward from the central drama. Sarah could hear fragments of discussion, the whispered recounting of her medals, the speculation about what other heroic acts might have gone unmentioned, the dawning realization that they had all been witness to something approaching cruelty, disguised as family dynamics. Colonel Harrison approached the small group that had formed around Sarah, his expression grave but respectful. "Captain Chen, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan myself. What you did that day, the tactical situation you described, the enemy contact reports, I remember reading about that incident. 27 minutes under sustained fire while conducting battlefield casualty evacuation under impossible conditions. That's not just heroic, it's legendary." His words carried a weight of someone who understood combat intimately, who could appreciate the split-second decisions and sustained courage required to pull off such a rescue. Other military officers began to gather, drawn by a combination of professional respect and genuine curiosity about the decorated soldier in their midst. "The insurgent position was elevated," Colonel Harrison continued, addressing the broader group but speaking with the technical precision of someone briefing a military operation. "They had overlapping fields of fire, multiple machine gun nests, and rocket-propelled grenade capability. Standard doctrine would have called for air support and indirect fire before attempting any rescue operation." Admiral Wells nodded grimly. "But there wasn't time for standard doctrine, was there, Captain?" Sarah shook her head slightly. "The vehicle was taking sporadic fire and there was fuel leaking everywhere. Lieutenant Morrison needed immediate medical attention, and every minute we waited increased the risk of the fuel igniting or his condition deteriorating beyond field treatment capabilities." She spoke with the clinical detachment of someone giving an after-action report, but the military officers present understood the understatement inherent in her words. They knew that sporadic fire meant bullets continuously striking the wreckage around her, that immediate medical attention meant David was dying, and that field treatment capabilities meant she had performed life-saving medical procedures while under direct enemy fire. General Morrison, who had been listening to this technical discussion with growing admiration, stepped forward again. Captain Chen's actions that day were reviewed by a joint military board, including representatives from 3 different services. The unanimous conclusion was that her actions went far beyond the call of duty. She didn't just save my son's life, she did it in a manner that demonstrated the highest traditions of military service. Melissa, who had been standing silently through this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Why didn't you ever tell us any of this?" Her voice was strained, barely controlled. "All these years, we thought you were just stationed overseas doing routine work. We had no idea you were in combat, that you were saving lives, that you were earning medals for heroism." The question opened a wound that had been festering for years. Sarah looked at her sister, seeing not the successful marketing executive who had marginalized her, but the confused young woman trying to reconcile years of assumptions with the reality now laid bare before them. "I tried to tell you," Sarah said quietly. "When I came home after my first deployment, I tried to share what I had experienced, but every time I mentioned combat operations or the soldiers I served with, the conversation would change. Mom would ask about my living conditions or whether I was eating well. Dad would ask about my plans for after the military. You would ask when I was going to settle down and start a real career." Patricia Chen's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "We were trying to be supportive," she whispered. "We thought talking about the dangerous parts would upset you." "You were trying to make it comfortable for yourselves," Sarah replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You wanted to think of my service as some kind of extended Peace Corps mission, helping people in a vaguely foreign place without real danger or difficulty. It was easier to think of me as playing soldier than actually being one." The brutally honest assessment hung in the air, and Sarah could see the truth of it registering on her family's faces. They had indeed sanitized her service in their minds, edited out the danger and difficulty, because acknowledging it would have forced them to confront their own discomfort with her chosen path.
That's not training or duty, that's character. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young woman in army dress blues, a first lieutenant whose ribbons indicated recent deployment experience. She approached Sarah with the nervous respect of a junior officer addressing a senior leader. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to thank you. I'm Lieutenant Rebecca Walsh. I was in the Officer Development Program at Fort Benning when you came to speak to our class about leadership under fire. Your presentation changed how I approached my first deployment." Sarah studied the young officer's face, trying to place her among the hundreds of junior leaders she had mentored over the years. "Lieutenant Walsh," she said finally, "you asked about making decisions when you don't have complete information." "Yes, ma'am," Lieutenant Walsh smiled. "You said that perfect information is a luxury combat leaders never have, but that paralysis analysis kills more soldiers than bold action based on incomplete data. That advice saved lives during my deployment to Syria." The exchange was brief, professional, but it added another layer to the evening's revelations. Here was concrete evidence that Sarah's influence extended far beyond her own unit, that her leadership and experience were shaping the next generation of military officers. Patricia Chen watched this interaction with growing comprehension. Her daughter wasn't just a decorated soldier, she was a leader, a mentor, someone whose expertise was sought out by other professionals. The casual respect in Lieutenant Walsh's demeanor spoke of genuine admiration for Sarah's knowledge and experience. "How many?" Patricia asked suddenly, her voice barely audible. "How many what, Mom?" Sarah replied. "How many young officers have you trained? How many soldiers have you led? How many people are alive today because of what you do?" The questions came out in a rush, as if Patricia was finally asking all the things she should have been asking for years. Sarah considered the queries carefully, understanding that her answer would shape how her family saw not just her service, but military service in general. "I've commanded 3 different units totaling about 400 soldiers," Sarah said. "I've trained maybe 800 junior officers through various programs. As for the other question, I don't keep count. Every mission we complete successfully, every soldier who comes home safely, every objective we achieve contributes to something larger than any individual action." General Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's the mark of a true professional." Captain Chen understands that military service isn't about individual heroics, it's about collective commitment to mission accomplishment and taking care of your people. The evening had reached a point where the formal reception seemed almost forgotten. The band had stopped playing, the servers had retreated to respectful distances, and most of the guests had formed a loose circle around the ongoing conversation. What had begun as a family wedding had transformed into something approaching a military awards ceremony, with Sarah at the center receiving the recognition that had been denied her for years. But Sarah herself seemed uncomfortable with the attention. She maintained her military bearing, responded to questions with professional courtesy, but her eyes kept drifting toward the parking lot, toward the escape route she had been contemplating all evening. Melissa noticed her sister's restlessness and felt a stab of panic at the thought that Sarah might simply leave, that this opportunity for reconciliation might slip away like so many others had over the years. "Don't go," Melissa said suddenly, reaching out to touch Sarah's arm. "Please don't leave yet." Sarah looked down at her sister's hand, pale against the dark blue of her uniform sleeve. "I wasn't planning to make a scene, Melissa. This is your wedding day. I won't ruin it."
You're not ruining anything, Melissa said, her voice thick with emotion. You're making it real. For the first time in years, something at a family gathering feels real instead of performed. The honesty of the admission surprised both sisters. Melissa had spent so much energy maintaining appearances, projecting success and happiness, that she had almost forgotten what genuine emotion felt like. I need to ask you something, Melissa continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Will you forgive me? Not just for tonight, but for all of it. For all the times I acted like your service didn't matter, like you didn't matter. For all the family events where I let mom and dad treat you like an obligation instead of a daughter and sister. The request hung between them, loaded with years of accumulated hurt and missed opportunities. Sarah studied her sister's face, seeing genuine remorse there, but also recognizing that forgiveness wasn't something that could be granted in a single moment, no matter how dramatic the circumstances. Melissa, Sarah said gently, this isn't about forgiveness. This is about understanding. For years, you've all treated my military service like some kind of phase I was going through, some extended rebellious period that I would eventually grow out of. But this isn't a phase. This is who I am. This is what I've chosen to dedicate my life to. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I don't need you to understand why I made that choice, but I do need you to respect it. I need you to stop treating my career like it's somehow less valuable than yours just because it involves risk and sacrifice instead of profit margins and market share. Patricia Chen, who had been listening to this exchange with growing anguish, finally stepped forward. Sarah, she said, her voice breaking, I owe you an apology that's years overdue. I've been a terrible mother to you. I've let my own fears and prejudices blind me to what you've accomplished, to who you've become. She took a shaky breath before continuing. I was scared every day you were deployed. I was terrified that we would get a knock on the door, that we would lose you. But instead of telling you how proud I was of your courage, I tried to pretend the danger didn't exist. I tried to minimize what you were doing because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging how afraid I was of losing you. The admission cost Patricia visibly. This was a woman who prided herself on control, on always having the right words for any social situation. But there were no socially appropriate words for this moment. No etiquette guide for apologizing to a daughter you had failed to see clearly for years. I understand being afraid, Sarah said quietly, but you dealt with that fear by making me feel invisible in my own family. Every time I came home on leave, I felt like I was intruding on your lives. You had all moved on without me, built routines and relationships that didn't include space for who I had become. The truth of this statement was undeniable. Sarah's childhood bedroom had been converted to a home office within 6 months of her departure for basic training. Family photos had gradually evolved to feature Melissa's achievements, while Sarah's military milestones went uncelebrated. Even her mail had been forwarded to her base address, rather than maintaining the fiction that she still had a home with them. David Morrison, who had been listening to this family reckoning with the perspective of someone whose life had been directly impacted by Sarah's service, finally spoke up again. Mrs. Chen, he said, addressing Patricia with the formal courtesy that military families understood, with respect, your daughter saved my life. She gave Melissa and me the chance to have this wedding, to build a life together, to have children someday. She did that while her own family was treating her like she didn't exist. His words carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what Sarah had sacrificed, not just on that day in Afghanistan, but in choosing a life of service that her family couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. I know, David, Patricia whispered. I know we failed her. I just don't know how to fix it. Sarah looked around the circle of faces watching this exchange, the military officers who understood her world, the civilian guests who were beginning to grasp the magnitude of what they had witnessed, her family members grappling with years of willful blindness. You don't fix years of damage in one evening, Sarah said finally. But you can start by seeing me as I actually am instead of who you wish I was or who you're afraid I might become. You can start by understanding that my service isn't something I'm doing to you, it's something I'm doing for something larger than all of us. She straightened her uniform jacket, the metals catching the light from the vineyard's string lights. I don't need you to be proud of me, but I do need you to stop being ashamed of me. I don't need you to understand my choices, but I do need you to respect them. The simplicity of her requirements stood in stark contrast to the complexity of the family dynamics that had brought them to this point. Sarah wasn't asking for elaborate gestures or dramatic changes, just basic recognition of her worth and respect for her choices. General Morrison, who had been observing this family drama with the eye of someone who understood both military and civilian perspectives, stepped forward one final time. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to resolving difficult situations, "Captain Chen represents the best of what we hope to achieve in our military leaders. She exemplifies courage, integrity, and selfless service. Any family would be honored to have someone of her caliber and character." He looked directly at Patricia and Melissa as he continued. "But more than that, she embodies the values that protect everything we hold dear. Her service, her sacrifice, her willingness to risk everything for her fellow soldiers. These things make it possible for the rest of us to live in freedom and security." The general's words served as both a tribute to Sarah and a gentle rebuke to her family. He was making it clear that their failure to appreciate her service reflected poorly not just on them, but on their understanding of what military service meant to the country as a whole. As the evening wound down and guests began to make their departures, Sarah found herself surrounded by military colleagues offering contact information, sharing stories of their own service, and expressing admiration for her achievements. The isolation she had felt earlier had been replaced by a sense of belonging, of being recognized and valued by people who understood her world. But it was the quiet conversation with Melissa as they stood apart from the dispersing crowd that provided the evening's most meaningful moment. "I want to do better," Melissa said simply. "I want to learn about what you actually do, about the places you've served, about the people you've led. I want to be the sister you deserve instead of the one you've had to tolerate." Sarah studied her sister's face, looking for signs of the performative emotion that had characterized so many of their family interactions. But what she saw was genuine regret, real determination to bridge the gap that had grown between them over years of misunderstanding and neglect. "It's not about deserving better," Sarah replied. "It's about being honest about who we are. I'm a career military officer. That means I deploy regularly. I face danger as part of my job, and I've dedicated my life to serving something larger than all of us. If you can accept that reality, then we can build something real between us." Melissa nodded, tears streaming down her face despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I can accept it. I want to accept it. I just need help understanding it." The conversation that followed was brief but substantive. They exchanged contact information, made tentative plans for Sarah to visit during her next leave, and began the delicate process of rebuilding a relationship that had been strained by years of mutual misunderstanding and neglect. As Sarah finally prepared to leave the vineyard, she reflected on the unexpected turn the evening had taken. She had arrived expecting to endure another family gathering where her service was ignored and her presence barely tolerated. Instead, she was leaving with public recognition of her achievements, a renewed relationship with her sister, and the beginning of what might eventually become reconciliation with her parents. The drive back to her hotel gave her time to process the evening's events. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more was the possibility that her family might finally be ready to see her as she actually was, rather than who they had assumed her to be. 6 months later, Sarah received a package at her base in Colorado. Inside was a framed photograph from Melissa's wedding, but not the official portraits.
This was a candid shot taken during the moment when General Morrison was speaking about her service, showing her standing straight and proud while surrounded by saluting officers. Below the photograph was a handwritten note from Melissa. "I'm proud to be your sister. Love, Melissa." Sarah placed the photograph on her desk where she could see it while working. It served as a reminder that recognition, when it finally comes, is worth waiting for. But more importantly, it reminded her that family relationships, like military missions, sometimes require patience, persistence, and the willingness to endure temporary setbacks in service of larger objectives. The letter that accompanied the photograph contained updates about Melissa's life, questions about Sarah's current assignment, and an invitation to be the godmother to the child Melissa and David were expecting. It represented the beginning of the relationship they should have had all along, built on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's lives. As Sarah read the letter, she realized that the evening at the vineyard had accomplished something more important than just correcting years of family misunderstanding. It had demonstrated that truth, when spoken with courage and supported by those who understand its value, has the power to transform even the most entrenched patterns of behavior. The woman who had sat alone at table 12, ignored and dismissed by her own family, had finally received the recognition she had earned through years of dedicated service. But more than that, she had opened the door to relationships based on honesty rather than convenience, respect rather than obligation, and understanding rather than assumption. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.